Welcome to the Farming on Purpose podcast, a podcast for farmers and ranchers ready to shift for a stronger future. Today's challenges in agriculture are new, but the grit and determination required to be successful are not. On the Farming on Purpose podcast, you'll hear how producers of all sizes and practices are moving mountains for things they believe in, all in the name of an industry that keeps growing and innovating for a stronger food system and stronger farm families. I'm your host, Lexi Wright, and I'm excited to discuss where producers are finding success, challenging the status quo, striving for better, and keeping our heritage alive, all while producing the food we depend on.
Welcome back to Farming on Purpose. Today, I am going to walk dangerously close to the land of economics, which I am not very heavily educated in. But this topic today I wanted to tackle is this trend and the statistics behind the fact that we are seeing more and more successful farms be supplemented by off-farm income and what that means for the industry as a whole. We'll start off with some statistics about this trend that we're seeing of really farms being more reliant on off-farm income and it becoming more and more difficult to have a career full-time farming, which is the goal for a lot of folks. So according to the USDA Economic Research Service, in 2021, 82% of U.S. farm household income came from off-farm sources. For a historical perspective, in the 1960s, off-farm income accounted for about 50% of farm household income. In the 1960s, off-farm income accounted for about 50% of farm household income. And by the 1980s, it increased to about 60 to 65%. And like I said, in 2021, we were at 82%. And in 2000, off-farm income actually accounted for about 90% of farm household income. So we're back down a little bit from that trend, but since 2000, we've fluctuated in the 80 to 90% range. So this trend shows a pretty big increase in farm reliance on off-farm income over the past 60 years, which is when we started to see a lot of these big changes. We had a number of significant events happen in those past 60 years, and it is a great reminder, in my opinion, that the food system in the U.S. is young compared to many other places. The food system in the U.S. is robust and is impacted by a lot of things. And the ag industry as a whole is pretty fluctuating. And it's kind of crazy to think about that from a perspective like mine, where it's like we don't necessarily do things differently than anybody in my husband's family did before us. A lot of the things that we are doing are still exactly the same that they did, but times change and other factors change. So let's look at some of the factors that are influencing that trend. One of the biggest ones is increased mechanization and efficiency, which has reduced, in air quotes, on-farm labor needs. Now, I say that in air quotes because has it reduced on-farm labor needs? Yes, absolutely. Completely obviously. Bigger tractors mean less tractor operators, etc. A lot of other things impact these, like some of those tractors not being able to be fixed on farm, having to take them into a dealership to be worked on, or to call the dealership to come work on them. That would be an on-farm labor need that is no longer being utilized because of the shift in the industry there. On-farm labor still absolutely required, still absolutely valued, still absolutely one of the biggest challenges that we see, especially for farms that are growing and are smaller. Making that jump from a small farm to a medium-sized farm is so challenging if you don't have enough on-farm labor. So that's why I say that in air quotes. Another trend that is contributing to this is there's a growing number of opportunities for off-farm employment, especially in rural areas, as we've seen a pretty big shift in the job market to allow for remote hybrid contract roles. And there's a lot more widespread internet in rural areas. There is a lot more opportunities for people to have employment from home or a lot closer to home than they previously did. So this allows a lot of farm operators to diversify their income in a different way just because this opportunity exists. So that is an important one to recognize. Volatility in farm incomes and market fluctuations, weather conditions. So this is also like a cyclical thing. It is based on other factors, economic, market, as we said, and weather trends that are completely out of the control of anyone who is actually doing the farming. And we see this as some of these things shift, we start to see the numbers reflect the percentages of off-farm income shift as well. Increasing costs of farming operations relative to farm income. Now, I did not pull specific data on this factor, but I think all of us can agree that the cost of farming has risen pretty noticeably within the past decade, and I'm sure it was before that as well. If we can't control the cost of our inputs and we can't control the costs or the price of our outputs, that leaves us in a pretty challenging place when it comes to being able to have diversified income. So looking at data from the past 50 to 60 years ago, this 82% that we saw in 2021 of farm home income being off farm, it's a big jump, but it is consistent with trends over the past 2 decades. So this isn't like a new jump. It's been happening for a while. It is important also to recognize that the farm size is impacted or is a factor here. Larger farms generally rely less on off-farm income, according to USDA, and smaller and medium-sized farms are a lot more likely to depend on off-farm sources, primarily because those small and medium-sized farms require outside investment to grow and to maintain. And then they also have a lot more risk associated with income levels. So it's nice to have that cushion of some kind of off-farm income in the family to make sure that the bills still get paid. Regionally, we also see that farms in the Midwest, in the Great Plains, and then in California that are more like specialty crop farms are a lot more likely to be larger farms, so tend to depend less on off-farm. So this cutoff that we tend to see in where this difference is in how farms are depending on off-farm income is around the $350,000 in annual gross income from the farm. So once farms are above that $350,000 mark, they are much less likely to be dependent on off-farm income. If they're smaller than that, they're much more likely to be dependent on that. In 2017, the Census of Agriculture reported that 58% of all farmers had a primary occupation other than farming. That statistic is almost more shocking to me than the 82% of farm income being off farm, because the word primary there is just a little unsettling to me, because there's a lot of farmers that have off farm income that might be farm related still, like maybe they fence, they install fence for their neighbors, or maybe they process cattle on their weekends for people who don't have the equipment, or maybe they sell feed, whatever it is to be qualified as off-farm income. But having a primary occupation other than farming being at 58% is pretty shocking to me. If 58% of farms are not focusing on production primarily, that is a little bit of like a statistic that I would like to pay attention to. Going back to that number of 350,000 of gross cash farm income, only about 8% of all U.S. farms reached that level. Those farms that are over 350,000 produce about 80% of the total value of agriculture production. That is a statistic that it's difficult for me to wrap my brain around. The fact that only 8% of farms are accounting for 80% of value of agriculture production makes it a pretty concerning statistic, because we are relying on a very, very small number of farms for the vast majority of the food system and the products that are produced in this country. It says that the average size of farms in this category, so with that gross cash income of over 350,000, was approximately 1,500 acres in size, which the overall average farm size is about 441 acres. So these are triple the size or more of the average farm in the U.S. Again, the geographic distribution of these farms is pretty heavily focused in the Midwest, in California, and then a little bit in the Great Plains. These farms are much more likely to be family owned, but to have a different organization structure, such as a partnership or an LLC, something like that. They're also more likely to have multiple operators and hired managers. So these are farms that we're thinking like there are multiple people in the family or outside the family who are making decisions on a day-to-day basis. And that is significantly different than farms that are smaller than that $350,000 mark. A couple trends that I think are very interesting here as well, and I want to circle back to that multiple managers piece. So they've analyzed these farms that are 1,500 acres, $350,000 or more in gross cash income. And they see that these farms have something in common. They're usually bigger adopters of technology, which makes sense. If they have that amount of income, it's a lot easier to afford that investment in technology. They probably have different or better market access than some of their smaller competitors. So that could be direct marketing, value-added production. They are a lot more likely to use futures contracts, other risk management tools. Some of this could be just from the sheer fact that they have a larger amount of product to market, so they have access to some of these different markets that smaller producers don't. They are also much more likely to have higher levels of formal education and have more farming experience or come from multi-generational farm families, which that one is definitely a well-known fact. And then while they do derive a lot smaller percentage of household income from off-farm sources, many of them still do have off-farm income. It could be from investments or from a family member working off the farm instead of the farmer or the manager having a alternative primary income source. The other thing that these farms have in common is that they are diversified. So either they have multiple sectors in agriculture that they are producing for, so crops or livestock and different types, or they have some vertical integration going on. So they are owning more than one step of the production, processing, marketing, trucking, transportation, something. They're doing more than one of those steps, and that helps them have a competitive edge. So when we look at this data of this trend that more and more farmers are having off-farm income, and more farmers are having off-farm income as a primary source of income, unless they're at this mark of over 350,000 in annual gross cash farm income, it gives this message of get big or get out, right? And we're seeing that trend actively happening. There's kind of two ways to look at this, I think. We all know that farming is a huge financial responsibility. That's just the reality that farms today face, especially first generation farmers. There's no easy way around that fact, and there's really no way to avoid that fact. Now, do I think that all farms should seek to become these larger farms that are at least 1,500 acres and producing at least $350,000 in annual gross cash farm income? No, not necessarily. To me, that doesn't increase the strength of the food system. And it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you would ever be a full-time farmer, because obviously that goal is pretty hard to achieve and it depends on a lot of factors that are outside of your control. But if you want to be a farm that is successful and is working towards being a full-time farmer and not relying on off-farm income, I do think that we can take some of those factors that we see are as common for these larger farms and we can apply them to our own operations. So let's look at the first one, and that was adoption of technology. Now, that is something that requires investment, which is not always the best option or decision for a farm to make. But how can we look at technology that we can adopt that maybe is not high cost? Some of those technologies that people are using and adopting for larger farms are management software for data in addition to advanced machinery. It's more record keeping. So how can we use some of those same principles on our farm? Better record keeping is something that we are definitely committing to on our own farm. As we made the jump from our small farm that we lived at before we moved to this farm where we have our own acres, we're renting acres, we're becoming more diversified. More record keeping has quickly become a necessity. Before, we kind of relied on like a wall calendar that we wrote on, and we'd look back at texts that we sent each other to be like, okay, well, we put the bulls in this day, or try to remember when events happened that we needed to know. And as things have gotten busier and we've gotten a little bigger and more diversified, that's not working anymore. Having a system that we can rely on to track things and manage and analyze that data is really important, and something that we are going to be doing this year. There are a lot of programs out there that can help you do this, but I'm also a big believer in bootstrapping it until it makes sense for you to invest in those things. We're going to be using some old-fashioned spreadsheets and some free data management tools to see how they work and see how they do for us this year. And then in the future, if we decide that this is paying off for us and we want to increase our investment in it, then we'll go ahead and do that. Another piece of technology that we have already chosen to invest in, and it was a pretty big decision for us, was to get a hydraulic chute. So this a more advanced machinery than we probably needed at the time. Now I think we're pretty glad that we did invest in that when we did, but we could have gotten by with a head catch. And I've talked about this a little bit before on another episode, but for us, getting that chute was an investment in our labor management as well. I didn't feel comfortable using a head catch gate because I didn't have experience doing that. And because we don't have a great setup to work our cows in, it's pretty important that we catch them when they go through the chute. So having a hydraulic chute that's easier for more people to operate, easier for our kids to learn on, that is something that we felt was a good investment for us. So these technology adoption things don't have to be huge. It's more about thinking about, okay, what does this idea of technology adoption do for these bigger farms that allows them to be successful? And try to adopt those ideas versus thinking that we need to invest in the biggest, best machinery out there. Market access. So what can we take from that common trend we see in these larger farms that are more likely to not have off-farm income, or at least less of it? To me, that one is about analyzing the markets where you're at. And that's not always something that we do, especially if we've done something and it's worked okay for us in the past. It's something that I think has to be done fairly often because market situations change fairly often. Keeping an eye on this, it's definitely a time-consuming thing, and it's hard to navigate, I think, when you're new to it or maybe don't have a lot of experience in it. But taking that awareness of where the markets are at, what opportunities exist near you, networking and trying to find more market opportunities is really important. And then knowing what your numbers are and analyzing what they could be if you did things a little bit differently. Direct marketing and value-added production were two of the ones that were mentioned when they looked at the market access of these larger farms. So looking at those, seeing if transferring your model, or at least diversifying your model to include one or both of those, could be something that is helpful to you if you look at your market access and it makes sense. So analyzing and being open to some of those opportunities is just part of what we need to be looking at there. The other one I would say is that they mention is the futures contracts and risk management tools. We have not used those in the past because for us, the way we've looked at it to this point, and I'm not saying this is right, wrong, or indifferent, is that when we have thought about using those, it seemed like we were ensuring the potential gain away from ourselves. So we were covering ourselves in case of loss, but we were also preventing ourselves from greater gain in some of those situations. So that was the case then. I think we need to continue to analyze if those are valuable tools for us in the future and recognize when they could be helpful to us as well. The next one is education and experience. There's no good way to get experience other than do it. And you can't get more yesterday. You can only get more today and tomorrow. So I think that is one that is important when we think about our kids. Like, how do we get them a diverse experience? If they're at all interested in doing production ag in the future, the more diverse experience that we can get them, the better. And that might not always mean working for us. That might mean like having them go work for other people in the community, internships, working off farm, or even like at a ag job that's not production ag. So trying to set them up well for success. I think we can learn a lot from those experiences through them as well, even if we're not the ones that are going out there and doing it. We can also lean heavily on this by constantly being open to investing in our education, even if it's not formal education. Just get on some news lists for like extension programs that are happening in your area. Be open to doing some research on YouTube, learning that way, whatever it is for you and how you learn best. Just constantly being aware that the more you know, the more experience you gain, the better off you're going to be. And that is true as we see in those large farms as well. And then the last one that I wanted to look at there is diversification. This one is well known. I think it's kind of the very first thing that we tell producers anymore is if you want to have a greater chance of being a full-time producer, or if you want to increase your income, diversification is probably the first thing that you need to look at. And again, this is about looking at the opportunities available to you, looking at the resources and the assets that you have on your farm, and thinking about how they could be put to better use or to additional use and what that might look like. So that's kind of some of the things that I think people who are interested in growing their operations and finding ways to rely less on off-farm income can pursue. I think those are ones that a lot of us inherently know, but actually putting them on a list of this is how we're going to do this makes it seem more strategic and like a plan versus just always knowing it's good to learn. Oh, it's good to remember to diversify, or it's good to remember to look at the opportunities available to me. We know those things, but sometimes it's sitting down and putting a plan together for how we're going to do them that makes a difference. The next thing I want to talk about, though, is how we actually manage this situation that a huge number of farmers are in today, where we are relying heavily on off-farm income while trying to build or invest and grow a farm so that it can support us full-time. There is a lot that goes into this, and there's a lot of things that are impacted by it. One of the big ones, we're smack dab in the middle of this right now, is time management. We are in a busy summer season where there's a lot of farm work. There's been a lot of farm work all spring. There's a lot going on, and we are trying to manage that alongside jobs and family and kid activities and all of these things. And time management is just hard. Sometimes there's just not the number of hours in a day that you wish there were, especially when we tie in the second factor, which is physical and mental fatigue, where when you're trying to manage all these things, heck, it's tiring. And when you're trying to do it in 115-degree heat, it's rough. It's just, you hit a wall sometimes where it doesn't feel like it's ever going to get easier. And of course it does. Things slow down. You hit a season where there's less going on. But in the moment, it really doesn't feel like it's ever going to get there. So being aware of those stressors and that those are things that are seasons is important. Taking care of yourself is important. And it's easy to say that, and it's a lot harder to do. But I would say the most important thing there is to look at patterns in your life. And if you are in a season of physical and mental fatigue, where you feel like time management is a real challenge because of the different priorities and responsibilities that you have, that's one thing. If you are in a cycle of this that never stops, it's time to reanalyze. So knowing where those patterns are and being willing to look at where you're at with kind of a fresh set of eyes or get others' input on that can be really helpful. Financial stress is another big one, and that one I think is pretty obvious. That's why the off-farm income is existing in the first place. And how we address that, I don't know. I have thought a lot about this, and I think about it all the time, honestly, of what is it that we do differently to decrease the financial burden of farming? What is it that we do to decrease that stress? And there's a lot of answers. It's really hard to tell what are good answers and what are not good answers, because some of the things that we've used in the past, like government programs that reduce that financial stress, may not work like we want them to. So trying and to find new answers to that question is a big part of what this podcast is about. And I think that if you listen to some of the guest interviews, you will find nuggets and ideas of how other people are reducing that financial stress and finding success with that. With all of those also comes family and relationship strain. This is a concept that I think about a lot because I think farming and motherhood have a lot of things in common. In most farms, just like there is often a default parent in a family who is most likely to handle parenting and care tasks, in a farm, there's also a default manager who is most likely to handle certain kinds of tasks on the farm that no one else really has to deal with or knows even is going on. This might be like repairs on equipment. This might be fixing fence. This might be feeding at the same time every day. It depends what it is for your farm, but there are probably tasks that generally fall to the same person that the rest of the team or whoever is on your farm working may not even know exist or are physically incapable of completing. And a lot of times that can create strain between family and especially between spouses. And that's just because I think we don't always fully understand each other's priorities and where our heads are at as far as what we're trying to manage in the moment. So communication is key for these, and giving each other lots and lots of grace is also key. Again, I think if this becomes a pattern instead of a season, it's time to reanalyze, especially if it impacts your kids. I think I've heard of a lot of friends that chose to never be involved with agricultural life because of the family and relational strain that they saw in their parents, or that they had that relationship with their dad or whoever in their family. They said, that's not going to be the way of life for my family. And they chose to turn away from that. And that's not something that is sustainable for agriculture. So focusing on that and realizing the impact of that in your own family is really important. The last point that I want to make here is that a lot of times we can feel like off-farm income is preventing us or limiting us from doing the things that we want to do on our farm. And it can feel like seeing our farm grow, helping it to expand the way that we want it to support a bigger part of our lifestyle, can feel like watching grass grow. It feels like it's not going anywhere. The growth is so slow and incremental that it feels like it's not even happening. And that concerns me a little bit because I think we are seeing an influx of new and beginning farmers and interest in that sector. But because of the time that it takes to grow a farm to profitability and sustainability, especially for multiple operators, I think we're going to see that farming age continue to be a problem in our industry, where we get started too late in building our farm because we have to wait until we can afford it. And then when we finally can afford to have a farm that we get to be involved in, we are at retirement age. And that's when it's finally, okay, I feel like I've got a grip on this thing. I feel like I can afford it and it's not going to eat my whole life savings. I feel like I have some of the equipment that I've always wanted to make jobs easier. And then it's time to pass it on to the kids and we're not ready. So I think that's going to continue to be a really big challenge that we have to figure out how to face. And I don't know, maybe the answer is having bigger farms with multiple operators so that you can have a younger generation and an older generation working side by side. That's not the model that a lot of these new and beginning farms are set up to be on. So I think that's something that I hope there's research going into, and I hope that folks are thinking about for their own farming models and what the future of that looks like, and being realistic about what paths they're on and what makes sense there. I think we have to figure out what makes sense for ourselves and for the amount of effort that we're putting in. Are we going to reach our goals? Are we going to get there realistically on a time frame that makes sense? And how does that impact other people in our lives? That can be a very challenging conversation to have with yourself, but I think it is one that is worth having. The other thing is with off-farm income, like I said, sometimes we look at it negatively, but it can actually be something that helps us on our journey to full-time farming more quickly. Focusing on off-farm income in a season or for a period of time can help us to make those investments more quickly in our farm than we would if we were not utilizing that off-farm income. So it can actually speed up the process to full-time farming. It can also help you gain more skills depending on your job and a better network to help your farm grow and have access to better markets when you are full-time farming. So I think that's something that we can consider as well. Curious to know what your thoughts are on this topic and where you fall in the data points. If you're relying on off-farm income and what that looks like for you, what kind of time frame you hope to be on if you are considering pursuing full-time farming, and what that might look like for you. So if you would like to engage in the conversation, hit us on social media or in the Farming on Purpose Facebook group, and make sure that you are subscribed to the Farming on Purpose email newsletter. We talk about lots of this data and behind the scenes information there too.
If you've enjoyed spending time with us today, please take a moment to review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or join the conversation on social media. Do you have a topic you would like to discuss or know someone with a story to share? Apply to be a guest on the podcast at farmingonpurpose.com. You can follow the host of Farming on Purpose, Lexi, on your favorite social media platforms for more content by searching for Farming on Purpose. And remember, if you look around your table and aren't inspired by the people there, it's time to find a new seat.